QSO Today, episode 381, Kirk Kleinschmidt, NT0Z. I don't say it enough that I truly appreciate and am grateful for the listeners' support, both financially and with your messages of encouragement, in addition to the sponsorship by Icom that has allowed me to bring you 381 episodes of QSO Today. Since I'm posting on Christmas Day 2021, I want to wish you all, in the spirit of the holiday, a Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy, and successful New Year. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4 Zulu 1 Uniform Golf, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo returns on March 12, 2022. If you have a ham radio subject that you'd like to present at the expo, please use the link on the show notes page to get to the expo website and click on the Call for Speakers and Presentations box. In addition, we've created a copper-level sponsorship to allow your radio club, organization, or small business to appear as an exhibitor in the expo. If you'd like to extend the reach of your organization, please consider coming to the expo as a sponsor. Kirk Kleinschmidt, NT0Z, has spent most of his professional life working in amateur radio as an editor, author, and contributor to the amateur radio magazines that we have grown to love, including QST, the AWRL Handbook, Spectrum Monitor, and other magazines. His own book, Stealth Amateur Radio, continues to advise us on how to get on the air and enjoy our hobby even when our living situation is against it. NT0Z is my QSO today. NT0Z, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Kirk?
I am here. Thank you so much for having me on. This is quite an honor.
Well, it's my pleasure, Kirk. Thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I think my ham radio story started more with shortwave listening as a kid. I was one of those precocious kids who took everything apart, built electromagnets, tore apart machinery, equipment, anything I could get my hands on. And my father kind of recognized that, so he brought home some shortwave radios one day from an auction. He's kind of an auction collector guy, and he brought home a Zenith Transoceanic and some giant console radio. And so I kind of went through the shortwave listening phase, and I had a lot of fun with that. And some point along the way, I discovered that there was amateur radio and a means by which I could talk back. And so I started reading voraciously. Nobody in my family and nobody that I knew at the time was into ham radio, but I pretty much picked up every ARRL magazine and book that I could get my hands on. And when I was 15, I took my novice license, and that was the first start to my amateur radio career, if you will.
What year was that?
1977.
You remember your first call sign?
My first call sign was WD0BDA.
So they weren't giving out the N in those days.
Well, they might have been, but not to novices. Novices had the 6-letter call signs, and back then you had 1 year to upgrade, or that was all she wrote. And
did you upgrade that following year?
I did. I updated the following year, and there's kind of a funny story about that. I would say that I overstudied for the general class exam. I had been on the air a lot. My code was pretty good, but I overstudied all of the material I could find on the general class exam because back in the day, the volunteer examiner system wasn't yet in existence, and you actually had to go to an FCC field office to take your test. And that was 110 miles away from home. I wasn't able to drive, that distance, nor did I have a driver's license at the time. So I had to have my dad take me there. And so, we drove to St. Paul, and he was waiting in the car, and he had a big stack of newspapers. And so I went in, and I took a long time on the general class exam, way longer than I needed to. So I passed with only one wrong. And at that point, the examiner tossed down the advanced class test and said, "Okay, here you go." And I said, "Well, what's this?" I said, "I didn't study for this." She said, "Well, here it is in front of you. You'll at least get a look at it." Because again, back in the day, there were no question pools. There were some services that kind of corralled the tests and the answers, but that was all definitely under the table, and I certainly didn't have access to that. So I was concerned that I was going to upset my father, who has now been waiting in the car for over 2 hours. So I just kind of zipped through the advanced class test, and when it was all over, I had the maximum number wrong that you could have and still pass, and the examiner graded the test 3 times right in front of me because she really did not want me to get that that ticket, it appears. But I did get my advanced class license then at 16 and kind of escaped my novice 1-year time frame.
So for those of us who know about the advanced class and what the privileges were, there's probably a large number of listeners who may not know about the advanced class because it's not offered anymore. What was the advantage of having an advanced class license in terms of operating?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that's changed a lot over the years is exactly where the sub-bands for the various United States ham license classes begin and end. So I can't actually tell you what the big advantage was. I remember there were some parts of the sideband sub-bands that advanced class ticket holders could use that general class could not, because one of my friends also had an advanced class license, but most of my distributed friends around Minnesota did not. So if we ever wanted to have a quote-unquote private conversation, we could go to our exclusive advanced class subband and torture the rest of our friends. But there might have been some Morse code subbands that were exclusive to advanced class. I know there were for the extra class, which was one of the factors that kind of prompted me to upgrade to extra class. I believe I did that in the mid 90s.
At the time that you still had to take the 20 word per minute CW test?
Yep. You still had to do the 20 words per minute back then.
So you had the real code extra.
The real code extra, not that means a whole lot in the big picture, but, hams from my era, I think more of us, kind of made friends with Morse code. I remember there were people, who legitimately just could not grasp the code, and I really felt for them. I wasn't among them, but I learned code the wrong way. I kind of learned it the Boy Scout way, where you look at the dot and dash figures in the book, and that's the wrong way to learn the code. You really want to learn via the Farnsworth or the Koch method, where you're hearing code elements at speed with a lengthened space between elements and words. And because I learned the quote-unquote wrong way, it's really limited my conversational ability with Morse, I think, throughout my whole ham radio career. I can converse at 20 words a minute, and if I'm doing a contest where I can anticipate the small amount of data, coming from the other guy, I can probably do a little stretch at 50 words a minute, but it's not comfortable. And I think that it would have been if I had learned a quote-unquote better way. I
took a CW Academy class earlier this year and discovered that the two methods that you're talking about is what they're deploying. And it's actually very good. I kind of had to unlearn what I learned as a novice and relearn it. And it was actually quite interesting. I encourage people to, if they have an interest in CW, to go to CW Academy and try that out.
I know there's CW Academy, and there's another thing, I think it's called CW Ops or whatever, where they actually have a class where they, you join the class on Zoom or whatever once or twice a week. That's supposed to be a good one, too. I don't remember the exact details.
That's CW Academy, owned by CW Ops.
Okay, gotcha. All right, good.
Right. And then there's the Long Island CW group, which also does classes. And what I find so fascinating is that the number of people that are pursuing CW appears to be greater than, as a percentage of the hams, than there ever were. So it's kind of cool, I think.
Yeah, that could be. I remember in 91 when they made the no-code switchover, I had no idea what would become of Morse. And there still seems to be a lot of Morse practitioners, but unfortunately I see a lot of Morse contesting nowadays, but I don't see as much kind of general rag chewing as we used to. And that's probably because of 18 years of horrible propagation.
And it appears to be, at least from what I can tell, it seems to be picking up with Sunspot Cycle 25. Let me ask a question. Did you have a local amateur radio club in your town? Once you got your first license, did you actually discover that there was an amateur radio club?
There was no amateur radio club in my town. I grew up in Little Falls, Minnesota, population about 7,000. There were a few hams here and there, and I did eventually find a couple of them. But there was no club. There were repeaters in Brainerd and St. Cloud, which are about 35 miles north and south. So, it really was kind of mostly a bootstrapping myself with the assistance of ARRL publications. I know that sounds really corny in some sense, but that's exactly how it happened. I found a guy, Dean, I forget his last name, so I apologize, Dean, who gave me my novice test. And, you could do that at an individual's residence back in the day. You might be able to still do that. I'm not sure. And I took my test with a local ham-to-be named Dale, and we took the test together, and he became WD0BAC, Dale Ritchie, and I became WD0BDA. There were a couple of old-timers in town. The father of one of my acquaintances / friends from middle school. He was an old timer when I met him, and he passed away soon thereafter, but he gave me the requisite J37 straight key, which I still have and use very occasionally. And there was a fellow by the name of Bob Sappington in town. And he used to let me borrow his Drake twins because my radio at the time, a Tempo 1, could not work split in the contests. And so I don't know whatever prompted an old timer to lend a whippersnapper his Drake twins, but he did, and I'm forever grateful for that. But no actual club. There probably were clubs in St. Cloud and Brainerd, but I was young enough at the time that I didn't really access them if they existed.
But it sounded to me from what you said earlier that you actually created a group of friends being on the air in Minnesota or just around the country?
This was mostly in Minnesota, and these were 3 or 4 kids my age, 14, 15, 16, 17, and we would chat occasionally on 75 meters. I'm trying to remember the one of them that I ran into not too long ago, Dan, KB0EO. He became quite the ham's ham. He's 150 miles to the west of me. I haven't seen him forever, but I would like to. And I don't remember my other fellow teenage hams really, but it was definitely an informal group. It wasn't anything organized.
It occurs to me that kids like to talk to kids on the air. Did you have QSOs or rag chews with older hams?
Oh, I would say most of my QSOs and rag chews were with older hams. As I was looking through my QSL card collection, I saw many notations, when I would say age here 15, age here 17. This would prompt a lot of rag chews with older hams. And I can only see it as an older ham now. I can see looking back that, if I had run into a kid on the air, I would be more interested in rag chewing per se. So I think the fact that I was a kid, it prompted a lot of rag chews. I really wasn't seeking kids. I was DX crazed back in the day. That was kind of my whole introduction was, shortwave listening. I wanted to hear stuff from far away. And when I became a ham, sure, I talked to anybody and everybody, but I really wanted to work DX. My first DX, by the way, was DA1KV. I believe he was an American soldier in Germany, and that would have been 1977, back when we had a cooperative ionosphere.
And now this message from Icom America. Spice up your ham shack with Icom's IC705. This portable radio is perfect for staying in and venturing out and working your favorite bands this winter season. Happy holidays from Icom. The Icom IC705 is the perfect sidekick and QRP companion. Base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingertips in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 MHz. It has a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display. 5 watts with the BP272, 10 watts with the 13.8 volts DC power supply. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functionality. A touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. Micro SD card slot. Speaker microphone using the HM243, and it comes standard. It supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack, with its special compartment for your IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or a day out in the wild. Our family of favorite Icom amateur radios are also available this holiday season. The IC9700, the IC9300, the IC7610 base stations, the ID52A handheld coming soon, and the ID5100A mobile are the perfect gifts, and it's the most wonderful time of the year to give a gift of Icom. For more information, click on the Icom banner in this week's show notes page, and when you purchase your new Icom rig, please tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. You said that you had a Henry Tempo 1. Did you have that as a novice? What was your novice rig?
Well, let me think about that. My novice rig, there were a couple. My aforementioned friend Dale Ritchie, who became WD0BAC, he happened to be blind, and in Minnesota we have a thing called Courage Center, which runs a group called Handy Hams. And so Handy Hams actually lent Dale some pretty sexy radios back in the day, an Atlas 350, some Drake Twins. And so when I didn't have a real radio of my own at first, I would go to Dale's house and use, I believe at the time he had a Drake 2C with a 2NT transmitter, and then he got an Atlas 350 XL. And so I would use his radio. The local hams, kind of in affiliation with the Civil Air Patrol, gave me a radio, but it was really quite an antique. It was a TCS-6 from a battleship. And I think this one was never on a battleship, but it came out of a stockpile somewhere. It had a dynamotor supply that weighed about 100 pounds, and this definite World War II tube-type transmitter receiver would put out about 25 watts of AM or CW from 1.5 to 12 megahertz. I actually used that on 80 meters for a bit. But soon thereafter, we moved to a new house, and the house was new and it was, built from scratch. And so I spent the whole summer laboriously landscaping the big sloped wooded lot. And one day, about the second day of school in September, I came home from school and there was a Tempo 1 sitting on the kitchen table that my father had gotten for me, unknown to me at the time, for landscaping the yard. So I had the TCS6. I built a Tuna Tin 2. I think that was in 76 when it first came out in QST. I would take the Tuna Tin 2 and ride it out to the local National Guard base where my mother worked. They had a electronics shop there, and they happened to have a KWM2 and a big dipole. And so they would let me come in the electronics shop and hook my Tuna Tin 2 up to one of the antennas and use the KWM2 as a receiver. So my actual Novice radios were a bit of a hodgepodge until the Tempo 1 showed up mysteriously.
So, Kirk, did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Absolutely. It's a bit embarrassing. I started college in 1980. Started out on track for electrical engineering, and I went to St. Cloud State University in Minnesota for a couple of years and transferred to North Dakota State in Fargo. And then I ran into the buzzsaw of fourth semester calculus and differential equations. And honestly, the writing was on the wall at that point. And I had been working as a radio newscaster and a DJ, kind of putting myself through college. And so I didn't want to waste all of those EE credits. So I convinced the university to let me design a technical writing degree or technical journalism degree, which they did not offer, but they knew about. So they said, well, find an advisor, develop a curriculum, and we'll approve it if we like it, and then you can do it. And they did it. And so I wound up getting a lot of credit for my work history in broadcasting. No reason to take introduction to, audio editing if you're doing it every day at work, so to say. So it turned out to be a real blessing in disguise for me. So I got a lot of credit for my work history in broadcasting, and I managed to graduate so that my father would not kill me.
Truth be told, that is exactly where I crashed and burned in my fourth semester of engineering school, was differential equation. So
yeah, it was a killer. I'm really good at math theoretically. Like, you can describe the concept to me and I get it. I just could never do the proof.
It actually sounds like you turned that disappointment into an opportunity.
I think so. At the time that I did it, it was kind of a Hail Mary thing. It's like, oh my God, I have to graduate or so many bad things are going to happen to me. So, what's the most likely path of success? What am I interested in? But honestly, it was kind of a Hail Mary at the time. But the joke was ultimately on me, because in one way, shape, or form, I've been working as a technical writer pretty much every day since. And I discovered that I had a reasonably good talent for translating engineering gibberish into English. And so I think the university had the last laugh there.
It seems to me that you have a whole string of amateur radio credits in terms of writing. So can you talk a little bit about that? Sure.
After college, I had been, as I mentioned, working in radio as a newscaster in Fargo-Moorhead, and the station that I was working at got bought out, and they just emptied the newsroom, laid everybody off, and moved their own people in. And so I had just graduated, and I was in Fargo-Moorhead, and I was actually living in a hotel that had been converted to efficiency apartments. It was kind of a low point in my career, so to say. And I saw a job opening at AWRL. I kind of think it was for a job opening in the contest branch, as I recall. And I was a little bit desperate. And so I actually FedExed my application to AWRL with pretty much my last $10 bill. That kind of tells you when it happened, because you could FedEx a letter for $10 in 1988. And so if I recall correctly, the contest branch, because of my history, the contest branch passed my resume down to the AWRL book team and the QST team. And my boss-to-be, Mark Wilson, was heading up the book team at the time. And as the story goes, he was surprised and sort of impressed that I FedExed my resume. And so he looked it over, and they invited me out there and took a couple tests, and the rest, as they say, was history. So I started as a AWRL book team editor in 1988 and worked on a couple of things to get my feet wet. Most of them, I don't even remember exactly what my first couple of assignments were, but at one point they said, "Hey, we need you to edit the 1989 ARRL Handbook." And that really rocked me back, because the handbook was literally my ham radio Bible. Even before I got to Newington, I probably had 20 of them from various years on my bookshelf. And even though I kind of protested, I'm not your handbook guy, I'm just a kid, I'm green around the gills or whatever, there weren't enough editors to go around. And so at that point, I learned that the handbook isn't updated in a major way every year. At least it wasn't then. So there were, years where there were just a few tidbits updated, and then there were years where major updates took place. And so they assured me I was going to preside over a very minor year because of my junior status. And so the first thing of note that came out of my time at AWRL was I was indeed the editor of the AWRL Handbook, not because I was particularly worthy, but because I was there.
For people that don't really know much about the AWRL book business, how important do you think the AWRL book business is to spreading knowledge of amateur radio then and now?
Well, I can only really speak to back in the day. The ARRL is kind of like the flagship membership association, if you will. It has the various sister societies all around the world. And I think a lot of amateur radio book information kind of makes its way into the sister society publications. At least back in the day, I think it was probably more important than it is today, because, we've got quite a developed internet, way to disseminate information, and talented individuals can really get their information out there in a much broader sense. Back then, in my day, ARRL publications and QST, I think, were really sort of a pinnacle. So I definitely think that the book business was probably more important back then than it is today, although I would still consider it important today. And the same goes for QST. I think it was more important and more relevant back in the day. I know it was a lot bigger, about 100 pages bigger on average than it is today. So, but different times, and it was really fantastic for me to be working at ARRL. One of my favorite stories, kind of goes along with that. In high school, I would go to the library and get a big stack of QST magazines and bring them with me to class, where I would read them in any class that didn't hold sufficient attention for me. And this used to really annoy some of my teachers, including my journalism teacher, who was kind of a friend of the family. And we all loved him, but boring is boring. So anytime the boredom reached a certain minimum threshold, I'd whip out the QSTs and start reading it. And so after my boss moved down the hall to the QST editorship, he kind of dragged me with him. So I moved with him from the book team to the magazine team. And so shortly thereafter, I was back home for some vacation or another, and I was driving down the road and I saw my journalism teacher sitting on his porch. He had retired. And I stopped in and I said, "Hey, remember that magazine I always used to read in your class?" He's like, "Oh my God, how could I forget?" I said, "Well, I'm an editor at that magazine now." And so he congratulated me. He said, "That makes me feel a lot better. And now I have to ask you to speak to the journalism class," which I got roped into doing. And so we put a bit of closure on the reading QSTs in class.
How did your career proceed after that?
I was at AWRL from 88 through 94. I think a little bit less than a year on the book team, and then about 5 years as QST's assistant managing editor. I really loved AWRL. Pretty much universally positive experience. It was so nice to be around, people and lab engineers who were super knowledgeable about things that I was interested in. And so I thoroughly enjoyed my time at HQ, but I did not enjoy the fiscal realities, cost of living, if you will, of Connecticut at the time, which was extreme. I didn't know it at the time, but the job that I eventually took had been vacant for about 10 months because at the time, I don't know if it still is this way or not, but at the time in the late 80s, you couldn't move to Connecticut for a job, not at ARRL anyway, because you couldn't afford to live, especially if you had a family. So you either had to already be in the Hartford, Connecticut area. You had to be a kid such as myself who was willing to do anything. After 5 years in Fargo, I would have gone anywhere short of Siberia. Or you had to be independently wealthy, like some of the recent ARRL folks. If you've already had a career and you've got plenty of money, then you can, give back to amateur radio. So, the writing was on the wall after 6 years. My partner and I, no matter how much we worked in the jobs that were available, we'd never buy a house, so to say. And so after 6 years, I decided to come back to Minnesota. Now, in hindsight, I'm not sure that was the best decision, but that was the decision at the time. And so I know a lot of my friends in Connecticut at the time were, kind of epitomized that saying married to the mortgage, because you had to have two incomes in the family and, nobody could get more than a sniffle or you'd lose the house. And so I didn't really want that for the long term, and I didn't really see a way out of it. So in summer of 94, I moved back to Minnesota.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I see that you write for other magazines, or you wrote for other magazines in addition. What was your profession?
I did. When I came back to Minnesota, I still did a fair amount of editing for QST. I was doing QST is broken up in, at least it was at the time, editorially, feature sections, technical sections. And so I was actually editing a lot of feature articles for the magazine and editing a lot of new product announcements and whatnot for the magazine, which was a nice bridge for me. I started writing the ham column for Popular Communications in 1989, which actually was part of an ARRL trade out with the magazine. So the magazine would give ARRL a big full-page ad in Popular Communications, and in exchange, I would give them my monthly column. And ARRL would pay me for the column as a regular, assigned job duty. And so I was still doing that when I came back to Minnesota in '94. And that eventually, I was also writing features for Popular Electronics and Monitoring Times. And so in 2001, the September 11 kind of crimped off all of my gravy trains, so to say. I'd been working as a technical writer for some local industry. I'd been doing the editing for QST, and everything was fine. But in 2001, the economy contracted a bit because of the September 11. And so AWRL pulled their work in-house, as did the other places I was working as a contract technical editor. So 2001 was a kind of a cataclysmic year for my business. But I kept on writing the PopCom column after the trade out with ARRL was discontinued. I don't remember exactly when that was. And then PopCom, would kind of pay me directly for it. PopCom led to Monitoring Times. When PopCom was just before it went away, the finances of PopCom were pretty questionable and things were getting kind of rocky. And I was actually writing for Monitoring Times at the same time. And they said, well, we've now discovered you're doing that. You have to pick one or the other. So I picked Monitoring Times, and a couple months later, PopCom went away. Monitoring Times was a good run, but about 5, 6, 7 years ago, Bob Grove decided to retire, and Ken, one of his main editors, took over, and the publication morphed into the Spectrum Monitor, where it still is today. And so it's been a long run for me. I've pretty much written a column every month on amateur radio since July of 1989. So if you put that together with a bunch of feature articles and product reviews for QST and all that, somewhere between 420 and 450 articles and columns over the last 30 years or so.
You wrote an article for the Spectrum Monitor in February 2018 called, "Did Joe Taylor K1JT Destroy Amateur Radio?" Part of this futuristic piece was the prediction of a flu pandemic, subsequent changes to ham radio and regulation. How close do you think that piece hit home?
Well, the flu pandemic thing, that article was written entirely to be provocative, not necessarily in a negative way. Although it did go viral, it was republished with my permission in about 25 overseas publications. It caused quite a stir. The real reason I wrote it was because of kind of perceived changes in amateur radio that were kind of, maybe exacerbated or exemplified by the FT8 thing. And so the name of the article was, "Did Joe Taylor Destroy Amateur Radio?" And we talked a lot of, the article talked a lot about the perfect storm, the convergence of issues surrounding FT8. And I think some of them are, we haven't had a cooperative ionosphere for about 18 years. And so the easy, casual DX contacts and chats and rag chews and friendships that people who came up in amateur radio back in the era that you and I did, we had a lot of expectations about, we kind of took it for granted that, the QSOs would always be easy and chatty and friendly and plentiful, but they really haven't been for the past, let's just call it 18 years. And so millions and millions of conversations on the air really never took place. And this, I think, fundamentally changed amateur radio. There's been a significant lack of communicating. at the same time, we've had rapid technological progression. And so when it comes to FT8, I love FT8 because of the technology, but I don't love FT8 as a rule because it diminishes communication in that way that I was getting at in the article. And, I don't want to characterize one generation versus the other, but let's just say a lot of my younger friends, they won't answer their phones. You have to text them, right? They won't pick up the phone and talk into it. And let's just say they're younger generations for the sake of argument. I don't really have a hassle with the generational differences. But whatever the difference is, the ionosphere went away. Technology progressed to the point where you could most effectively communicate in ways that really didn't involve any interpersonal communication, whisper, FT8, whatever. The older digital modes have really kind of gone south, RIDI, PSK31, even Morse code from the way it looks at, my station. So this perfect storm of, wow, we're really not doing a whole lot of communicating anymore for a variety of reasons. This kind of prompted the article. And so my biggest beef, if you want to call it that, with FT8 is that I'm not really involved in it. Like, I can't participate in it. I don't have to decode it. I just, I don't even have to be there. If I want to kind of violate FCC rules here in the States, I could fully automate my FT8 station and it could make QSOs and tell me how much fun it had. And that is my big beef with all technologies like that. And as George in the previous podcast pointed out, there are some hams that he calls propagation hams, who are just, they don't really want to chat. They just want to kind of test propagation with Whisper and FT8. And I'm completely okay with that. I recognize that amateur radio is a very broad hobby. And so I'm okay with that. I'm just lamenting this perfect storm of millions of conversations gone, no ionosphere, technology progressing to the point where participation as hams, isn't really required. All I can do is, if I want to go on FT8 or Whisper, I click a mouse and I could literally walk away and do something else that kind of required my participation, so to speak. And so I did that article. It was very provocative on purpose, and it got a lot of reaction. Most people misunderstood it. They thought I didn't like FT8, but I could kind of see how that came to be. But the purpose of the article was to spur conversation about this communication deficit, if you will, in this shift to modern amateur radio.
I read the article and I kind of came away probably the same as you did. I think that FT8, or what Joe did, was he kind of resuscitated amateur radio in a period when anybody trying to get on or trying to make contacts was probably very disgruntled or disappointed on the one hand. On the other hand, for some reason, every contest weekend, it seems all of a sudden there's propagation. So I don't know how that works. But one of the things I was thinking about as you're talking about this, and as I was reading the article, what it also seemed to do in terms of the digital modes, it prompted even brand new hams to create something like JS8 Call, so that you could have the technology of FT8, but a slight bit of rag chewing involved there so that there was communications again. Now, of course, it's text communications and not voice communications, but it seemed to spur another layer of innovation. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right in the big picture. I've messed around with JS8 Call a little bit, and for me, the communication rate is still too slow. It feels, the back and forth is still a little bit limited to kind of, what I'm used to or what my neurology is looking for. I was really happy with PSK31. And I didn't get around to experimenting with kind of other similar multi-tone technologies like Throb or MFSK or the various Olivia, things like that. And, some of those are perking up and coming back a little bit, which is good. And I think cycle 25 will do a lot of good things. If it's convenient to chat via sideband with its 10 to 30 dB, performance deficit versus a variety of digital modes, then I'm hoping that more of that will come back. But yeah, JS8 Call, I think, is a step in the right direction, but it's still just a bit of a step too far for me in terms of actual communication rate, but I do appreciate it.
Your QRZ page says that you work QRP RTTY, and I guess that I have not heard about many hams that work RTTY QRP, but you've worked almost all states in this mode. What have you learned about QRP and the older digital modes?
Well, I was amazed that QRP RTTY doesn't even really seem like QRP. I probably have worked, 30, 40 DXCC entities, QRP, RTTY, mostly in contests, and I have now worked all states QRP, RTTY. I can't really tell you why, but the only thing I can think of is a lot of my RTTY operation happens in contests. And of course, in contests, you've got people with really awesome stations and people who are very skillful at copying you, whatever your transmission mode. So if there was any hidden benefit, so to say, it would be because most of my RTTY QRP happens during contests, but it does not seem like much of a deficit, honestly.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. You're the author of a book called Stealth Amateur Radio. Why did you write this book, and what's it about?
Well, Stealth Amateur Radio, just to set the record straight, AWRL, after I moved back to Minnesota sometime in the late 90s, AWRL reached out to me and said, hey, we want to do Stealth Amateur Radio and we want you to write it. And it's actually, Stealth Amateur Radio began its life as Jim Kierman's book, Low Profile Amateur Radio. Jim Kierman, KR1S, was a fellow editor back in my QST days. And I think he lives in Florida now. I'm not sure. Anyway, Jim wrote Stealth Amateur Radio. And for whatever reason, reasons completely unknown to me, in 1998, ARRL reached out and said, hey, we want a continuation for Jim Kierman's book. We want to call it Stealth Amateur Radio, and we want you to write it. And I said, well, what about Jim? And they said, well, don't worry about it. It's all good. You can use the material from the book that you like. You can add to it. You can subtract to it. Just consider it your own work. And we've kind of covered all the bases. And so that is actually how Stealth Amateur Radio started out. And it's essentially a continuation and amplification of what Jim KR1S wrote in Low Profile Amateur Radio. So it's basically kind of a collection of material on how to enjoy amateur radio, even if you're in an apartment or you're, subject to homeowners associations, or you just want to be sneaky, or it also includes things like if you don't have a radio, maybe you want to operate from a friend's contest station or from a club station, or maybe you want to set up a remote station. It kind of provides information on how to enjoy amateur radio regardless of your circumstances. And ironically, I think it's more relevant today than it was in 1999.
What do you think is the biggest takeaway from that book?
Well, that is kind of challenging. The biggest takeaway, boy, I'm not usually at a loss for words, but I'm kind of getting close there. I guess if I had to, the biggest takeaway is that where there's a will, there's a way. I didn't have to be stealthy, so to say, for sections of my ham radio career, including now. But for many, I did, and I was always lucky enough to find a way, to have a station with a pretty decent performance, even at QRP levels, often with antennas in attics and whatnot. So I guess if there's a takeaway, it's that where there's a will, there's a way. But you do have to learn some stuff, and mentoring in that area, whether it's from other hams who've done what you want to do, or whether it's from a book such as this, can really help you if you're trying to do amateur radio from less than ideal circumstances.
You wrote a terrific paper for QST called Catch a Falling Star about Meteor Scatter communications. Did you become a Meteor Scatter operator at that time?
I really didn't. I've been trying to be a Meteor Scatter operator on occasion ever since. The other day, I worked some Meteor Scatter on 10 meters, and it was a lot of fun. When I was a kid, again, going back to we had a cooperative ionosphere. When I was a kid, you could see the Aurora Borealis here in central and southern Minnesota lots of times. It was just completely commonplace. Now it's extremely rare for the past 15, 18, 20 years. And so I had wanted to try some ARRL scatter, if you will, and I've done a little bit on Meteor Scatter, but not nearly as much as I'd like to. And I have never yet tried any of the super fast encoded Meteor Scatter techniques that are kind of typically used on VHF and up, although I would like to.
What kind of rig do you have for Meteor Scatter?
Well, Meteor Scatter is ideally not a stealth technology. Meteor Scatter is often best done with, more power rather than less, and with a directional antenna rather than, some omnidirectional radiator stuck in your attic. But, it can work. My Meteor Scatter station on HF is just whatever HF rig I happen to have available. Lately, I've been using an Icom 7300 or my trusty Elecraft KX3, and my new Death Ray antenna, which is the nickname for my hex beam at 25 feet, the Death Ray. The Death Ray did just fine with Meteor Scatter the other day and on 10 meters, and I had a lot of fun. I just love how on Meteor Scatter, the signals are just puny weak, and then they pop in at 20/9 for 2 seconds to a minute, and then they go away. That is an unnerving sound, and it's creepy, but creepy in a good way.
I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone that actually operates Meteor Scatter at lower than VHF frequencies. So that's very interesting that you're talking about doing it on 10. Have you done it on frequencies lower than 10 meters?
Not that I recall, although it is possible to do Meteor Scatter on 12 and 15. 10 is one of the sweet spots. When a meteor zips through the atmosphere, it leaves an ionized trail behind that reflects radio waves, and it really reflects them strongest and longest, so to say, at approximately 10 meters. So I don't think there's any easier band with which to try Meteor Scatter than 10 meters. As I recall, and I could be off base on this, but as I recall, the lower you go in frequency, you kind of lose efficiency on the reflections from the ionized meteor trails. And the higher you go, you also lose time duration and efficiency. So a lot of Meteor Scatter happens at 6 and 2, and a little bit happens above 2 meters, but it's really casual, so to say, at 10 meters.
Now, you call the hex beam a Death Ray antenna. What do you really think about the hex beam antenna?
Well, I think the hex beam antenna is fantastic, and I'll tell you why. Over the years, as a young ham coming up, my friends, the guy who gave me the novice test, he had kind of the standard station back in the day. He had a 48-foot roan lattice tower with a 3-element tribander on top and a 80-40 fan dipole coming off the apex. This was kind of the standard at the time before we got into all the restrictions and HOAs and, deed restrictions and all of that. And so over the years, I would research antennas and is a 3-element tribander, is the performance on par with a 3-element non-trapped Yagi or a 2-element quad and so after lots of research, I've essentially realized that the 2-element beam, whether you're talking about a hex beam or a standard Yagi or even a 2-element quad beam, the 2-element beam is the minimum effective dose, if you will, for a little bit of gain and directivity on HF. And so, the hex beam has a lot of things going for it. It's affordable. You can put it together yourself. It has no traps, so it doesn't have any loss relating to loading coils, loading bars, whatever. You can run 1 watt or 2,000 watts into a hex beam. It's, very, very versatile. And it's still a 2-element Yagi, but on 5 or 6 different bands. So it's very space efficient. It's very cache efficient, and it still provides the minimum amount of gain and directivity on 5 or 6 bands. And so the question that I had earlier on, the hex beam, right? It's a 2-element Yagi. How does it compare to an affordable log periodic HF beam? Well, it turns out that it compares pretty much identically. How does it compare to a 3-element trapped Yagi? It pretty much compares identically. And so the upshot is, if you use the 2-element hex beam as your baseline antenna, until you get to antennas that have significantly longer boom length, like say a 4 or 5-element Yagi with a 24-foot boom, until you get to an antenna that's significantly bigger than a hex beam, your performance is essentially the same. And so, one might be a dB better here and a dB worse there. But essentially, the hex beam is the minimum effective dose. And for people who are looking for a little gain and useful directivity, the hex beam is pretty much unbeatable. And for people who have a hex beam, I think they can take comfort in the fact that there's really nothing to be gained by upgrading to a 3-element trapped tribander, because the traps have losses, etc. The next stage up the gain progression, might be a 4-element Yagi or a 5-element with a 24-foot boom, or a great big log periodic with a big boom on it, because as it turns out, boom length is a significant predictor of performance, whereas especially in terms of a log periodic, number of elements, it's really not that big a deal. So kind of like the quad was in the 80s or the 70s, the hex beam is kind of like I like to say the minimum effective dose, and provides a lot of performance for the buck.
Minnesota has weather, inclement weather. How does the hex beam hold up? Is it a robust antenna?
Well, I think the hex beam is quite robust. We had 90-mile-an-hour gusts the other day. You and I were going to do this podcast a week ago, but we had a derecho, which is kind of like a hurricane force winds that travel long distances over land. And so I had branches down and telephone poles snapped off, but my hex beam was undisturbed. And I think the thing that you want to do with a hex beam is most of the makers or the manufacturers offer something that they loosely call ice cords. And the ice cords are a secondary set of reinforcing cords for the hex beam structure that really add a lot of survivability to wind and ice loading scenarios. And so I think if you have a hex beam and you make sure you get the ice cord option, I think you'll be fine. No antenna survives hurricane force winds really, but I've had several ice storms, and then this 80 mile, we had 40 mile an hour constant winds for several hours with a couple of 80 mile an hour gusts here in Rochester, and the hex beam really wasn't affected at all.
What do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now?
That is really interesting. I'm sure some would say getting young people into ham radio, and that may indeed be the greatest challenge. Some would say that, spectrum encroachment is a big challenge, and some would say that the population of amateur radio operators that's kind of aging out right under our noses could be the problem. And many would say deed restrictions, HOAs, that kind of stuff. And I think these are all, kind of a perfect storm for amateur radio problems. It is interesting. And the one thing that I will comment on, AWRL and other organizations they've spent a lot of time getting kids into ham radio. And the tests and everything have been, kind of, for lack of a better word, dumbed down significantly over the past 20 years. And so my father used to tell me this, and I didn't really get it when I was a kid, but he would always tell me, we don't value things that don't cost us, whether in money or time and effort. And so if you're just given something, you tend not to value it as much as you would have if it cost blood, sweat, tears, cash, etc. And so with this tremendous dumbing down of amateur radio, for lack of a better term, and a drive to get more and more kids and young people into ham radio, I'm not sure if that's ultimately a solution. Because now as I look back over my life, I think my father was right. What I value most is the stuff that I put the most effort into. And so I'm not sure that approach to getting kids in amateur radio at all costs is the best one. But I'm also not saying that I have a better solution, if you will.
What excites you the most then about amateur radio?
What excites me the most is building amateur radio equipment. As a kid, I wanted to build stuff. I went to college to become an electrical engineer because I wanted to be the guy who could design the circuits, and all of these years I've kind of been what I would call a cookbook engineer, right? Give me a recipe and I'll build the thingy. I can test the thingy and I can tweak the thingy, but I can't really design the thingy from scratch. And so after all these 40 plus years of, reading voraciously and absorbing knowledge, I think I'm like a lot of hams, and I have a lot of seat of the pants skills, and I know a lot of tidbits about electronics, but I'm still painfully, obviously not an electrical engineer. And so a lot of my focus lately has been, trying to get up to speed, build my home laboratory, so to say, get more familiar with the tools. Like I have a spectrum analyzer and I've used it, but maybe only for 1% of its capacity. I have a digital storage oscilloscope and I've used it, but I don't really know it. And so a lot of my focus lately has been on building things. And I have built a lot of things over the years, everything from the Tunitin 2 to accessories to 1,000-watt linear amplifier. So I've built a lot of stuff, but I want to go that extra step and kind of tie it together with expanding my knowledge and facility with electronics and design and building and engineering. And I think now is perhaps the greatest time ever, to do that, because we have such an information overload. We have access to parts in ways that we've never really had before. So that's the building phase. And I'm also interested in finishing up some projects that have been, kind of long underway. A couple of years ago, I finished worked all states 160 meters QRP. Never thought I would work Hawaii until one night I worked 5 Hawaii stations on 160 with 5 watts. Turns out you just need an opening. And so I'm trying to finish off my CQ worked all zones. I have 38 zones QRP. I need 2. They're in the insanely challenging ones now, unfortunately. I'm trying to finish off 9-band worked all states QRP. I have DXCC QRP. I have VUCC QRP. But I have a lot of awards and stuff that I've been working toward for decades now. So I'd like to finish those off as well. And then build a lot of stuff. Basically, those are my 2 main focuses right now.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Wow. I think one of the things that I really wish that I would have had was more direct mentorship. And so, I kind of had to bootstrap myself up and use AWRL publications as a mentor. And I think they did a fine job for what they were. But if I would have had access to some more in-person or at least closer direct mentorship, that might have sped things along quite a bit. So there have been lots of changes in amateur radio in the past few years. And so returning hams, a lot of them are looking at the process of getting updated, kind of with glee and as a delightful thing, but not everybody is looking at it like that. And so if you can kind of secure a bit of direct mentorship, and then watch a lot of YouTube videos, I think that will kind of help you get back into the hobby. The other thing is, recognize that, amateur radio is a much wider hobby now than it was when I first got involved. And again, that's always a double-edged sword, but there's always somebody out there who's pretty much done whatever it is that you want to do. And you can really shorten your progress path if you can, kind of find those people, whether they're in your local circle of friends or whether they're on YouTube or, now a lot of radio clubs are essentially distributed because of the pandemic. So I would seek mentorship.
Kirk, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate all of your comments and the stories. But with that, I want to wish you 73 and thank you again.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate being here, and I had a blast.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Kirk. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in NT0Z in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu items at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in March. I am updating this as I have more information. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.